morning. Great to have you here in worship at Campbell. We're starting a series of worship services that we are calling Telegram to Text, from one generation to the next. There's been a lot of research and study on how different generations relate to one another, how different generations communicate, how different generations do church. And although talking about a generation means you're talking in large generalities, there's a lot to the research that's been done. So we're going to spend some time here in the next several weeks looking at several different generations. We're skipping over my generation, Generation X, because we always get skipped over. And we're not bitter about it at all. This week we'll talk about the greatest generations and talk about you all, you baby boomers next week. Talk about some millennials and then some youth and some kids and just get the whole spectrum of what it means to be church with so many different generations a part of it. Should be a fun time. This week, talking about the greatest generations, we turn to the book of Genesis and turn to chapter 18. In that book, where we read the story about a son being promised to Abraham and Sarah. The Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre as he sat down at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. He looked up and he saw 3 men standing near him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent entrance to meet them. He bowed down to the ground and said, "My Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree. Let me bring a little bread that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant." And so they said, "Do as you have said." Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah and said, "Make ready quickly 3 measures of choice flour, knead it, and make cakes." Abraham ran to the herd, took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to the servant who hastened to prepare it. And then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree while they ate. They said to him, "Where is your wife, Sarah?" And he said, "There, in the tent." And then one said, "I will surely return to you in due season, and your wife Sarah shall have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent entrance behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. Very polite, isn't it? King James Version, by the way, anybody reading from King James this morning, says it in a way only the King James Version is able to say it. Abraham and Sarah were old, well stricken in years. It had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I have grown old, and my husband is also well stricken in years, shall I have pleasure?" The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old?' Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? At the set time I will return to you in due season, and Sarah shall have a son." But Sarah denied, saying, "I did not laugh, for she was afraid." He said, "Oh yes, you did laugh." This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. My 97-year-old grandfather died a few weeks ago. An amazing influence on my life and an amazing impact on everything he did. He was born in the teens and lived till the teens. And my recollections of him are so amazing and powerful, and I could spend all day long sharing stories with you about him. I won't, you're welcome, but I could. He was a pastor, and so many knew him as Pastor Monk or Pastor Bryan. His name was Alonzo Monk Bryan, and he always went by Monk. He was a bishop, and so many knew him as Bishop Bryan, bishop in the Nebraska area for 8 years. But we knew him as Daddy Monk. Daddy Monk was our grandfather, my kid's great-grandfather, and he did amazing things. He was old school before old school was cool. He did what he did because it was the right thing to do. And you just do what you do because it's what the world throws at you. And for that generation, folks who lived through the Depression, folks who went over there to fight in World War II, that's why you do what you do. It's because it's the right thing to do. You just do what you've got to do. It's not a matter of seeking glory for yourself. It's not a matter of even being recognized. It's not a matter of working for your own comfort. It is a matter of knowing what is right and doing what is right because it's the right thing to do. They picked up my grandfather out of Texas and they dropped him in the middle of southern St. Louis with a couple $1,000s and said, "Here, start a church." And he did. A year later, there were 60 people worshiping at St. Luke's United Methodist Church, and they're still there. St. Luke's on Telegraph Road in St. Louis. And much to my grandfather's chagrin, there is a bust of him in the hallway commemorating him as the founding pastor. Because, of course, you don't do what you do in order to get a bust made of you. You do what you do because it's just the right thing to do. During this preparations for this sermon, I thought about showing a picture of him on screen as I talked about him, but then I realized he would hate that. He would hate having his picture up in front of y'all while I talked about him. He would hate that I'm talking about him so much, as a matter of fact. He would want us to get on with worship. Because you see, he was a church guy. He loved the church more than anyone I've ever known, and probably more than anyone ever will. He was a church man. He was a Wesleyan through and through, as Wesleyan as they could possibly get. Obviously had a great impact on my life. And like I said, I'm not going to spend all morning reminiscing about him, but I do want to let you know one thing about him in particular. He called us every single week to check in on us, to see how things were going, to just hear from us, to touch base. And on Sunday night, I knew he would call. And so during the week, leading up to that phone call, I would file away things in my mind that I wanted to share with him. And those things were always things about you all, things that you were doing as the church, the little moments of compassion that I had witnessed, powerful ministry that I had seen happen, a great presentation of music and worship, or something out of the ordinary, something extraordinary that I knew he would want to hear about, and I knew he would want to experience along with me. And you know, I find myself still doing that. In the week since he's died, I find myself still thinking, oh gosh, Daddy Monk would love to hear about that. Only now I don't have to wait till Sunday night to tell him, right? Did you see that? That was awesome, wasn't it? See, he got it about church. He understood something that I wish more of us sort of could get our minds around. He loved to hear about church, but he didn't necessarily like to hear me tell him about things that were always staying the same, and we are doing this, Daddy Monk, because we've always done that. That wasn't something that excited him. He loved to hear about different things, about unusual things, about unique things, new things that we were trying, experiments, crazy ideas, and weird things that we were doing to try to stir things up. He loved hearing about that because he understood something that I've always kept with me. He understood that if you do church like you once did church, you cannot be church. If you continue to do church like we used to do church, you're not being the church. The church exists not for the sake of we who are already here. The church exists for the sake of conveying the gospel message to people who haven't heard it yet. For the sake of sharing God's love with new generations of God's children. And Daddy Monk understood that if we were going to share the message with people who haven't heard it yet, we needed to say it differently. We needed to express it differently. He understood that even though he might not like it, if it was for the sake of the gospel of Jesus Christ, he was all in favor of it. I wish more people would feel that way about God trying to do something new in the midst of something we always have done in a certain way. I wonder if Abraham and Sarah had kind of a similar response when God told them that there was going to be something new happening in their lives. this something new was going to be a child who was going to be born into their old lives, into their greatest of generations. Because you see, like our greatest generation in our contemporary church, they had been there and done that. They had seen all there was to see. They had followed God as far as God had called them to go. They had served on every single committee. They had sung every single hymn in the hymn book. They had their scriptures memorized. They had taught Sunday school for years, and they could very easily have lived there in their tent at Mamre and been done with it. But God said, no. There's something new that's going to happen through you. There is something new that's going to be given birth in your midst. That greatest generation doesn't exist to care for itself, but to give birth to something new on behalf of God's promises. And Abraham and Sarah greeted this announcement with, shall we say, bemused skepticism. They laugh. They laugh right in the face of this message. Give birth to something new? You've got to be kidding me. You've got to be joking. What in the world could we possibly have to offer? And the messenger says to them, why are you laughing? Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? Wonderful. It's a great word. In the Hebrew, it can mean something that is too difficult for one's abilities, but it also can mean something that is outside of one's comprehension, something you can't understand. Is there anything that God can do? Is there anything that you want to put a limit on as far as what God is doing in the world? Is there anything that's too wonderful for the Lord? And they gave themselves to God's promises and gave birth to Isaac, whose name means laughter. Oh yes, you did laugh.